Welcome to the Fiction Workshop with Dr. M. The doctor is in.
Welcome to the Fiction Workshop. I'm Dr. M. We have a story today from an anonymous writer. We're going to hear an excerpt, and the writer's going to introduce themselves. Actually, it's not the writer since it's anonymous. I had someone else read it. A workshop usually would be a group of writers that would give each other feedback on stories. The goal for them would be to try to make the story better, to anticipate what readers would be feeling, and then to try to improve the work based on that. Since we don't have a group, I will try to bring up the kinds of things that writers would normally talk about, and hopefully this is something that you could incorporate into your own writing if you run into some of the same kinds of issues and things to keep in mind.
Is a writer who's published flash fiction pieces online. This is a story about harassment in the workplace and the ways women participate in it. The boss in the story is someone who isn't good with boundaries and is a little old school in terms of the ways he interacts with the women. He also feels the need to flaunt his authority. Mostly, the women at the office avoid him, but by the end of this story, they deliver the intern as a kind of sacrifice. The Jack Project. I was facing my screens with my sweater over my shoulders, as dressed down as I could get away with, because since his divorce, Jack would come up behind us, any of the single women, with a bulletin due in 10 days, and it was like he had all the time in the world. He wanted us to give 110%, and he wanted us to take it to the next level, and his stupid cliches were infecting the bulletin because he made untracked changes without telling us. "Hey, Jack," I said. "I'm busting my butt today. Is there something you need?" "I did all that," he said, and he waved his hand at my screen like he wanted it to go away. "I'm tightening up. You know how Carol likes it. Could use another pass." "Right," he said. "Carol. We need to do something about her." "You're the boss." "You wouldn't think so." "She's right about some things." "I was thinking," Jack said, "that intern Shelley, she's leaving soon. We should take her out to lunch." "Put it on the calendar." "Shouldn't it be a surprise?" He stood there a while longer with nothing else to say before he turned and went back to his office. This was by no means the end of him. He would send an instant message in under 5 minutes. And sure enough, the dialogue box popped open. "Where does our intern go to school?" I typed back, "She's at Bowling Green. They've all come from Bowling Green. We have a program." "Should we get her like a sweatshirt or a stadium blanket? We could get a really nice one." "College kids want money." "Is money a good gift?" "Money is a great gift." "Seems a little crass, a little thoughtless." "She will overlook any crassness, especially if you hit the right number." "Which is?" "Anything above 100. "Oh, I would, definitely."
So this is a first-person story, and I think one of the things we've got to talk about is first person versus a third person, and to keep it close to first person, a third person limited perspective. Now, limited perspective, but it favors the characters. In other words, the language of the character gets into the narrative. Probably the most famous examples of third person limited would be Flannery O'Connor. With a first person narrative, it's usually a bit more internal. There is some bias against first person among literary writers because there's this idea that you start out writing in first person and then you grow up and you mature and then you start writing in third person. Now, that's maybe a bit of a simplification, but there is a little bit of truth to it. If you would think about first person and writing in first person, the way you would often approach it is just to imagine yourself going through situations. And so you might have a main character who is a lot like you, a voice that's a lot like yours, or the way you would react to things. And so that's often seen as a little bit easy. Now, first person has gotten to be really popular. I saw something online that said something like a third of the novels nominated for prizes were first person, and in genre fiction, it's more. It's more like half. There's this idea that third person gives you more control over the narrative, and what that means is you're more like a puppet master. You see these characters with some distance. You can go into their heads, but you're not inside their heads all the time, and that's more what a first person narrative would be about. Now, in the story, um, I don't feel like the voice of the main character really comes out. First person can often be like a monologue, and there is emphasis on voice. I also don't feel like we really get into that person's head. Since we don't know the gender of this writer, if this was a male writer writing from a woman's perspective in first person in a writing workshop, we would spend a lot of time talking about that. I think many of the women writers would say, this doesn't read like a woman. And that's fair. And it's something that, writers should listen to. Now, there's a question of whether you can write from someone else's perspective. We live in a political atmosphere that encourages multicultural perspectives. We want characters who are not all white, not all heterosexual, not all middle class, not all from North American culture. And so publishers encourage that, and they also want writers who come from these other backgrounds. Can you write someone else's identity? Of course you can. Can you do it in first person? That may be a little harder, and you may run into problems. Now, my advice for writing someone else's perspective is to just think of them as human beings. And when you run into problems is when you're putting in things that signify their identity. So if I'm writing a woman and I say, and she put on her lipstick, a lot of writers or a lot of readers, especially if they know that I am a male writer, are going to say, this kind of threw me off. And if it's a realistic piece, which this one is, that may take the readers out of the story for a moment, and they may be suspect of this writer.
So I want to look at this opening passage, and we've really only got 2 sentences before we get into the dialogue. And I can tell that the sentences have really been worked over. There's a lot of information that is arranged in a way that I think is really working. But I do want to tighten it up, and that's one of the things that you'll just have to go over it and over it and over it, add and subtract. One time you may notice something, another time you may not. What is tripping me up a little bit here is we get the phrasing because since his divorce. And so this is kind of dangling at the end of this sentence where there's already a lot of information. So my solution here, I want to break it up, but I think we can do this in separate sentences. Now we've got a first person narrator. The situation is that there's a woman and her boss is kind of hovering over her. He seems to be someone who maybe is not good at boundaries and maybe is not that smart and also not good at his job. The women seem to be running the office here. And I think that I'll talk more about this elsewhere, but I think that this is a story that probably wants to be in third person. I would recommend a third person limited narrator. You get some of the advantages of first person with limited because you can have a lot of the phrasing, but it can be personalized. So a lot of this would be saved. About the only thing that would be lost here would be he would come up behind us. And I think, you can make this just change it in third person to, and single women is not exactly true. We do learn that he hits on the married women as well. So it may be that you would name some of the women that he hits on. The names in here are great. There's Marty, Nance. I want to name this first person character because we do get great names. And I think usually in a first person narration, you don't always get the character's name. But because the reader is going to be waiting for it, that's another reason that I would argue for a third person limited narration here. So let's look at this and just kind of go through some of these sentences here. I can say, and I'll just give her a name. You're probably better at naming than I am, but I'd say Holly. And instead of was facing my screens, let's make it hid behind her flat screens because she is trying to avoid this boss, and that sets up that idea right away. Sweater over her shoulders, as dressed down as she could get away with. New sentence. Since his divorce, Jack would come up behind the women of the office, and with the bulletin due in 10 days, it was like he had all the time in the world. He wanted us to give 110%. He wanted us to take it to the next level, and his stupid cliches were infecting the bulletin because he had untracked changes without telling us. So the us is something that you're going to lose, but you can reorder these sentences, and most of this is going to be kept. So you can keep stupid. This is from this narrator's perspective, and I really like the end of this passage here because he's using cliches. The idea is that she's trying to get work done, and he's been, you've got some specialized knowledge here with untracked changes. This is the language of Microsoft Word. So your readership here would understand changes. Some of your readers would understand untracked changes because, track changes is the language that we use. He's not using track changes, and that's causing her problems. He's changing things in the document. He's a bad writer. He uses cliches. And I think that those ideas come through, and really the second half of this is great. So I think because there's so much information here that we're trying to get set up before we bust into the dialogue, and the dialogue is good, by the way. I'm busting my butt today. That works really well. Then you could slow it down a little bit, break this into a bit more sentences. I think a shift to a third-person limited perspective, and I think it's going to mean you're going to have to watch out for the language of us. It's that word that is a really good one because it's inclusive. Me and the other women in the office. In third person, you'll have a little bit more distance, but you can still create the idea of the solidarity with the other women of the office trying to stay away from this guy, Jack.
That's the workshop. Consider sending us something if you got a piece you're working on and you want some feedback on it. You can do this anonymously. Where we go from here depends on what gets sent in. Any level of writer, any genre, I will give you my honest feedback and we'll look closely at the story. All right, thank you. See you soon.